Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know many of you who are on the call today, but my name is Mallory Baker. I am with Walker Consultants. We are a transportation and mobility planning and design firm with offices all over the country, but I focus on the Mountain region and I manage our entitlements practice, meaning I help developers adhere to parking and transportation regulations in the Mountain region. We are focused today on the City of Denver's new Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, which went into effect on June 1st, and it affects the vast majority of projects being developed in the City and County of Denver. So the City of Denver has already done a pretty great job putting out clear and straightforward resources for how to adhere to Denver's new TDM ordinance. The methods for doing that, the worksheets that you have to fill out, the actual materials that you submit to the City of Denver are pretty simple. And there are plenty of webinars and resources on those specific logistics. And at the end of this presentation, I will put those in the chat for your review. But what the city is not going to tell you is how to make this ordinance work for you and your project. So today we'll focus a little bit on the ordinance itself, but we'll focus the vast majority of our time and hopefully our discussion at the end on how to make this ordinance work for you, work for your project, give you some actual tangible benefits. So we'll start with kind of backing up a little bit and talk. What does that mean? What are the benefits for the city, but also what are the benefits for you? Why is this a thing that the city is doing? Then we'll talk about the specifics of the Transportation Demand Management Ordinance that was just passed and went into effect again at the beginning of this month. We'll talk a little bit about your requirements at SDP or LVR submittal, your ongoing requirements on an annual basis, and then what the penalties are if you don't comply. And then we'll focus the bulk of our time on how to make this work for you, work for your project, pay dividends for you and your team. So first, what is TDM? So transportation demand management is the intentional use of policies and strategies really intended to redistribute or reduce demand for travel. And that especially comes to personal vehicle demand, or what's commonly referred to as single occupancy vehicles. So what might that look like? There are kind of two sides to transportation demand management. One side is the carrot side. So that's things like bolstering access to transit, higher service frequencies, and on the supply side, maybe subsidized transit passes, pedestrian and bicycle amenities, micromobility like e-bikes, e-scooters, stations and stops. Then there's the stick side. So the stick side might look like a gas tax. It might look like reducing your parking supply so there's only a limited amount of parking. It might also look like parking fees or some single ride fees for Uber and Lyft usage to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So those are some things that are transportation demand management. So why would a city want to pursue transportation demand management? What benefits does the city get from transportation demand management? A lot of the benefits are kind of altruistic and high-minded because these are municipal benefits. A municipality is intended to create strong quality of life and fiscal sustainability and social equity for its residents and constituents. So firstly, the city benefits environmentally. So transportation demand management helps a city reach climate and sustainability goals. Maybe they have a VMT reduction, vehicle miles traveled reduction goal. Maybe they have a greenhouse gas emissions goal that they must reach. This helps them with that. There's also a social component here. So on the social side, if you're bolstering or investing in other modes of transportation beyond just personal vehicle usage, you're providing options for all people to get to their destination. So not just people with personal vehicles. And finally, there's a financial benefit. So there's an opportunity cost to land, especially in core downtown areas, being used for parking. it can be used for other purposes. And that's why, you all are here. You want to develop amazing properties that offer great things to people, and parking, it serves a purpose, but it's not really the best and highest use of a piece of land. What about you? How do you benefit from using transportation demand management? There are a multitude of benefits, and you might be benefiting in some of the same ways that the city does. Developers are also altruistic, high-minded people who want to receive these benefits and see their communities receive these benefits. But on a more granular level, there are a number of key tangible benefits that you receive from enacting and initiating transportation demand management practices and policies. Number one, branding. So making sustainability a part of your brand can pay significant dividends when it comes to creating a lasting, memorable project. Think of the Coloradan as an example. The Coloradan has a shared parking program. It unbundles parking from its residential units. It really touts the fact that it's highly connected, highly focused on folks using other modes of transportation beyond the personal vehicle. And that's really a part of its, environmental, sustainable, even millennial brand. So that is a tangible benefit that developers receive when using transportation demand management. The second aspect is leasing. This can really help with getting people in your building and paying you money to lease your building. If you are a highly connected property, if you're capable of getting people to your property without a personal vehicle, that pays huge dividends when it comes to leasing arrangements. And then finally, there's also obviously a significant financial benefit. Enacting effective transportation demand management policies can allow you to build less parking. You need less parking, and parking costs tens of thousands of dollars per space to build. I know that is not news to all of you. It is hugely impactful to a development budget, and sometimes parking kills developments. So let's talk a little bit about Denver's new TDM ordinance. So first, why did Denver do this? It's really part of the implementation process for Blueprint Denver, which is Denver's comprehensive plan for the future of the city. It's intended to help the city meet climate and sustainability goals that the city has set. It also is intended to create, on the design and urban planning side, more walkable, more transit-friendly communities, which is a significant part of Denver's vision for the future. And finally, it's really seen by Department of Transportation and Infrastructure and Community Planning and Development staff as a pipeline to changes to off-street parking requirements. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this TDM ordinance does not off the top allow you to just have a TDM plan and link that to reductions to your parking requirements. The same off-street parking requirements are still in effect. The city knows that that is a little silly, and the city understands that this TDM ordinance is going to help them create data and collect some momentum to eventually parlay it into lasting sustainable changes to the zoning code, to the requirements that govern how much parking new development is required to provide. So let's talk a little bit about your responsibilities at the onset. So when you submit your site development plan or large development plan plans, finding my words here, that is when you're required to submit the materials to demonstrate that you have a strong TDM plan that adheres to Denver's requirements. So I'll put some resources in the chat at the end of this session, but it's really quite straightforward. They didn't want you to have to hire a consultant just to check off the boxes for the TDM ordinance. We'll talk a little bit about why you might want someone on your side to help you, but it's really just a spreadsheet that you're filling out. There are different requirements for different size properties, but basically if you have over 25 units for a residential property, if you have over 25,000 square feet for a commercial or office property, if you have over 250,000 square feet for an industrial property, or a combination thereof, you are required to adhere to this ordinance. So your responsibilities here are you are demonstrating that you are going to meet a pre-prescribed single occupancy vehicle reduction goal that the city sets based on your property location, the context of your property, how much transit availability there is, the size of your property development, and the type of development, so the type of uses that are included. You also, if you are developing a commercial property like retail, hotel, restaurant, etc., you are also required to meet visitor point goals. So that means that your TDM strategies don't only result in single occupancy vehicle reductions for the employees or residents of your site, but also people visiting your site to conduct commercial business or for leisure, etc. So you also have responsibilities on an ongoing basis. So the first thing you're required to have is a contact person, someone who owns TDM and can contact and interface with the city regarding your TDM plan. The city's calling that a TDM manager, and that person must be assigned as part of adhering to this ordinance. You also, at your zoning inspection prior to issuance of a C of O, you must provide proof of installation of any physical amenities. Those are things like maybe a transit stop or bike and ped enhancements like bike lockers or showers for people who bike to work. You also are required to provide proof of implementation of any programmatic strategies. So say you're providing subsidized transit passes to your residents, you'd be required to provide the city with proof that you did that 6 months after your C of O is issued. If you are in a larger, or if you have a larger development that's over 50 units for residential, over 50,000 square feet of development for commercial or office, and over 300,000 square feet for industrial, you are also required to provide on an annual basis proof that the single occupancy vehicle reduction was reached. And the way that the city is having you do that is by surveying your residents or tenants twice per year. So that's how the city is asking you to do this. They have some tips and tricks for how to do that. I'm happy to talk more about it too, but that is basically how the city is asking you to provide proof that you met that single occupancy vehicle reduction goal. So let's talk about what happens if you don't adhere to this. The first penalty is pretty strict and substantial. If the city comes out and does its zoning inspection and you have not installed your physical improvements for transportation demand management, if you promise to do that per your TDM plan, the city has said that they will hold your C of O. They will resolve that once you install and come up to whatever was agreed to in your TDM plan, but that's a pretty strict penalty, and the city has said that they will do that. They'll include this as part of your zoning inspection. There is also another penalty. If you don't submit these annual reports or you submit them late, there's an administrative citation. These are cheap. So the penalty for not submitting an annual report or submitting it late is not hugely substantive. These are the ranges: $150 for one time, $500 for the second citation, $999 for the third citation in 1 calendar year. The city has also said that it will cite developers or property owners and managers for each single occupancy vehicle trip over the max reduction. That is really the teeth that they're using to get you to adhere to this ordinance. But the city understands that this is an experiment and that all the single occupancy vehicle reductions that they are projecting are sort of, crystal ball assessments of what is possible using these transportation demand management strategies. So the city has said that they will only cite for each single occupancy vehicle trip over that max percentage that's set by your TDM plan after 8 years. So that's 8 consecutive years that you are not meeting those goals. And the city has to know and have proof that 3 or more properties in your context, in your neighborhood context, are achieving that maximum single occupancy vehicle reduction or below it. So what that is saying is that the city needs proof that this projection is real, it works in reality, and they have to receive that proof for many, many years in order for you to receive any of these more substantive penalties. So now let's talk about the more substantive part of this presentation, which is really making this TDM ordinance work for you. So the city has, in its documentation and what you're required to submit, it's pretty prescriptive. You're basically just box checking on which strategies you're going to implement. And those strategies, the city of Denver has pre-prescribed a percentage-based reduction for single occupancy vehicles based on each strategy. And your spreadsheet's just adding up. So you just say, let's say it's 10%, you just choose 2% reductions and it totals up to 10% and you're good. That's all you have to do. It could take 30 seconds if you wanted to not spend a lot of time on it. But what the city doesn't tell you is how to choose strategies that A, you can implement, and B, will actually help you and help your project and help your tenants and help your residents. So let's talk about how you might, go about doing this. The first thing is really understanding your own goals. So let's go back to some of those benefits that we talked about in the beginning. If your primary benefit that you're focusing on is the branding of your property, you're trying to create this sexy, environmentally friendly, sustainable property catered maybe to Gen Z, millennial type folks, what you might focus on is micromobility. And these are all strategies that are check boxes in the TDM worksheet. You might choose having a micromobility station or having some e-scooter share, bike share. So that's something that is great for your branding. You might have some bike amenities like bike lockers, indoor bike storage, showers for folks who ride bikes to your building. And you might also choose to unbundle your parking from your residential units. So that is a branding strategy that some buildings use to demonstrate, hey, you don't have to pay for parking if you don't need to park your vehicle here. And it helps with kind of, the intention to reduce parking demand, reduce vehicle miles traveled, have a more sustainable and environmentally friendly building and community within your building. If your primary goal is leasing and demonstrating high connectivity to potential tenants, you might consider transit pass subsidies. So paying for eco passes for your residents or tenants in your office building. You might consider transit connections or transit stops and stop investments. So having maybe a bus stop on your property is hugely impactful and demonstrates that connectivity. Transit connections are things like on-demand ride share or shuttles to an existing transit station or stop. If your primary goal is financial, meaning you want to build less parking, you want to spend less money on parking, the biggest bangs for your buck will be A, unbundling parking, which has huge impacts for reducing parking demand, and B, having paid parking, which has huge impacts for reducing parking demand in the real world. Now, the other thing you might consider is bike share and car share. And the reason I'm including this is not because bike share and car share have a significant impact on parking demand. They don't. Based on evidence, they have quite a minimal and in some cases not even an appreciable reduction potential to parking demand. But the city allows an administrative reduction for your parking requirements with bike share or car share inclusion on your property or even offsite. So you can kill two birds with one stone here. You can get your TDM plan done with bike share and car share, and you can have the added bonus of getting an administrative parking reduction using those components. So let's talk a little bit more about TDM and parking. So we are frustrated that the TDM ordinance that the city has enacted did not link up with off-street parking requirements. Parking management, reducing parking supply, having parking fees, unbundling parking are the biggest ways to reduce single occupancy vehicle arrivals to a site. And as developers, you are not really receiving any tangible benefits from this ordinance. Tying your TDM plan to a parking reduction is the way to get a tangible benefit from this ordinance. So talking about that a little bit more, at the site development plan or large development review process, you can use, and I've spoken with DOTI, the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, about this. You can use this TDM plan to bolster your administrative parking reduction request that specifically if it requires a ZPIN hearing, which is a public hearing for administrative variances over a certain percentage from the requirement. So you can use this as evidentiary support. Hey, we're doing this TDM plan. It adheres to the TDM ordinance. These are the impacts that are expected that Denver has projected for us. And this is the impact subsequently on our parking demand. You can also use this as evidentiary support for your Board of Adjustment variance. So if you are required to go to the Board of Adjustment instead of going just to staff because your parking reduction that you've requested is substantial, you can use your TDM plan as a way to justify that request. Denver has already done the math for you. It has shown you that these strategies will result in these reductions for single occupancy vehicle arrivals to your site. You can use that to demonstrate to the Board of Adjustment that your parking sizing well under the requirement is appropriate. The Department of Transportation and Infrastructure has also mentioned to me and others that they want this to result in reductions to the off-street parking requirements. So DOTI, in order to support that on an ongoing kind of like de facto basis, they've agreed to come to Board of Adjustment variance hearings to write letters of support for ZPIN or administrative parking reduction requests where people have submitted TDM plans and demonstrate their support. So that is a huge win for you if you are trying to get a substantial parking reduction and you have submitted a TDM plan that's in compliance. The other thing is with your annual monitoring. So you have those requirements at the plan submittal, and then you have these requirements on an annual ongoing basis per the ordinance. You could pursue, especially if you are providing your parking offsite, a post-build, post-CFO parking reduction. So let's say you're fulfilling your parking requirements in an offsite lease, and you obviously have to pay the donor property per space. With your annual monitoring reports, you can justify a reduction in your parking requirements with the data that you collect as part of your TDM ordinance submittal and requirements. And the other thing to note, especially for those of you who do a lot of development in Denver, maybe you're doing a development this year and you're expected to do many, many more in Denver Metro in subsequent years, DOTI and CPD are using your data to justify reductions to off-street parking requirements in the zoning regulation. So that is coming down the pipe. They're well aware that that's going to happen and they want it to happen. So the more we can use our data to justify those reductions, it will pay dividends in the long term because eventually parking requirements will be reduced. And so developers who want to have more transit-friendly properties are developing in high-frequency transit areas can use this and know that their parking requirements will be reduced ultimately. So I'd love to have a discussion about this, but just wanted to note that we're here to help. We do many, many parking reductions in the city of Denver and elsewhere every year. We are very well versed in the city of Denver's particular idiosyncrasies and requirements. And now we are getting to deeply know and understand adherence to the TDM ordinance. And while the city has, again, made some great resources on making this straightforward logistically, I would really say that if I were a developer, I'd want some help on coming up with transportation demand management strategies that actually pay dividends for my property and make sense for my tenants and my residents in the long term. rather than just kind of box checking, because you can get in trouble and some of these cost a lot of money to implement. And so having someone on your side that can kind of help you parse through that is important. This is my contact information. Many of you have it already. I have had the pleasure of working with many of you on this call, and I really appreciate you being here. But again, my contact information, if you have any questions, if you have a TDM plan that you're working on that you want to just chat about, if you're working on a parking reduction and you want help, feel free to reach out. Thank you all so much for your time. From Sarah, hi Sarah. Has Walker made any attempts to put any relative average costs for the strategies identified or required in the TDM manual? Yes, we have some cost ranges that we can that we can kind of put together and send out. They'll be property dependent. Some of them are based on actually like infrastructure installation, and some of them are based on our transit pass subsidies. So obviously the cost for things like transit pass subsidies will depend on how many people you're providing the subsidies for. But Sarah, I can follow up with that information for you. Any other questions or comments?
Mallory, I've got a question from Walter here in the chat. He's wondering, can you talk more about the logistics around car share?
Yes. Hi, Walter. And I think Walter is unmuted now. So the city of Denver recently put out a car share policy where that sets forth some requirements that the developer is required to adhere to get the car share administrative reduction. I think the administrative reduction for on-site is 5 parking spaces per car share space. So that's substantial. If you provide it off-site, it's a little less. It's up to the zoning administrator, so it's not set in stone in the zoning regulations. To get the car share reduction, you are required to have an existing contract with the car share company. I think it has to be in place for at least 5 years, and you have to submit that agreement to the city, and it's part of your SDP submittal. The issue
Mallory,
with car share. Oh yeah, sorry, Walter. Go ahead.
Yeah, are there actually providers out there? I know for a while there were a few different groups that were doing the car share thing, but now are they still in the market? Are they still in business? Are there vendors to go to make that happen?
Yeah, I'd say that now they're kind of coming back. So like Zipcar is no longer in the city of Denver, but there are a few companies that are starting to come back to Denver. Car2Go is one of them. Turo is another. There are also person-to-person, so car share companies that actually lease personal vehicles rather than having their own fleet. And the city of Denver has indicated that they would be willing to, allow that like in lieu of a traditional car share company with its own fleet. Some developers for larger properties are actually enacting their own car share. So owning their own personal fleet and having their own car share program, and the city of Denver also allows that. So while there were a number of years where there really weren't any vendors working in the Denver area, I'd say there are a couple traditional ones now reemerging, a bunch of kind of person-to-person, more coordination car share companies, and then some folks who are taking the initiative of just creating their own car share because they've determined that it's worth it for them to pursue.
Great, thanks. Hey, one other question for you. It's not related to car share. On the transit pass option, are there transit passes available that are transferable? And where I'm thinking about this in terms of coming into play would be, say you had 10 transferable passes that people could check out and use. Does that product or that type of pass exist?
I am not sure if the Eco Pass is, so the RTD Eco Pass is really the only transit pass
Right.
available in the Denver market right now. I'm not sure if it's transferable. I'd have to check on that. The city of Denver in the TDM strategies is also, they're also allowing for like a bike share or like an e-bike or micromobility pass. And I believe those are transferable. But Walter, I will check on that and follow up with you because I'm not.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it just, to me, it doesn't make sense to provide everybody a pass because there's certain people that are just never going to use that. Whereas if you had 10 or 20 or whatever the right number is for a given project, it would also make it really easy to gauge trips saved, right? If people check out a pass and use it, that's a trip on a car that they didn't take. So.
Yeah, and I would say like right now there's a lot of there are a lot of things that are up in the air with how the city of Denver is going to enforce this ordinance in reality. And I think the transit pass one is still a little squishy. The spreadsheet that they're having folks fill out now basically just says like, you know, you get a certain percentage reduction up to your total based on the level of the subsidy. So it has to be at least 50%. You get more if it's 100% subsidized. But they don't say like, can you just have that available and people can request it? Or do you have to have it available for anyone, any tenant, any resident? Because that would obviously be a lot more of a substantive investment versus just waiting for someone to request it and then offering it. And I think the city of Denver is not quite sure what it's going to require or ask of folks once it comes to like proving that you've implemented this programmatic element. But we're in close contact with Doty and the gentleman who's kind of like the key contact on this plan. And I ask him a new question every other day because I think that there are a lot of things about this that are not quite hammered out. So it's kind of TBD, and I will let you know as we have more information on that. Meg Verplank asks, is a TDM plan now required for all new construction, or is there a size requirement, et cetera? So there are 3 tiers. So tier 0 is there's no TDM plan required. That is anything for residential under 25 units, for commercial or office under 25,000 square feet, and for industrial under 250,000 square feet. So if you're under that threshold, you do not have to do this TDM plan. If you are in tier 2, that is when the city requires proof in your annual monitoring that you're meeting this SOB reduction goal. Again, the penalties are squishy because the city of Denver doesn't have a crystal ball. They don't know that these SOB reductions are even reasonable. So like you wouldn't really be penalized quite like any time in the near future for not like complying with that SOB reduction. But if you're in tier 2, that's 50 units or above for residential, 50K square feet for commercial and office, 300K square feet plus for industrial. Any other questions or thoughts? I'm seeing something come up in the chat. And Hardy, thank you, Hardy, for looking for being my webinar co-presenter. The EcoPass is not transferable. I didn't think it was. I don't think it is. That's why I think it would be great if you could just provide this as a benefit and say you provided a subsidy as a benefit and then provide EcoPasses to those who request it rather than buying in bulk and giving them off to anyone. But that's what I thought was the case. Thank you, Hardy. Anyone else have questions or comments? Okay. Well, if you think of any questions or comments, or you would just like to chat with me, feel free to reach out. I hope to hear from each and every one of you. And thank you so much for being here this morning and sharing your thoughts and questions.